And what I would like to do specifically is I would like to cut up this talk in 4 sections. So the first is going into bilingualism and cognition and the link between those a little bit more elaborately, specifically looking at the intricate clustering of individual differences, and specifically looking at the older adult lifespan. So not just bilingualism and cognition in general, but as it pertains to the 3rd age. And having said that, so having discussed bilingualism as people already are bilingual, I would then like to turn to a different kind of setting, namely 3rd age language learning. So what if people are not already inherently multilingual in one way or another? If we then introduce a new language later in life, can that have certain benefits that might be similar to the kind of benefits that we see in lifelong bilinguals? But the majority of today's talk, the 3rd part, I would like to spend on ongoing work that we do within our lab, Bilingualism and Aging Lab in Groningen, on 3rd age language learning effects. And some of this is ongoing work. For some of the projects, I do have findings to share, others not yet, but I think it would be nice to give you an insight into what we're doing. And I've taken about 45 minutes, probably roughly, for this talk. So there'll be ample time for questions and discussion. And I would love to hear your thoughts, especially as some of the work that I'll be presenting is still work in progress. So I would very much like to hear your input on that as well. So without further ado, I'll dive right in there. But before I do that, I would like to introduce some very important people as well. They'll be popping up as part of the talk. But these are really challenging times, obviously, especially for our young researchers, junior researchers, PhD candidates. And a lot of the work that I'll be sharing is their work, essentially, including even the slides. Thank you to Floor and Jelle for helping out with the design. A big shout out to them, and you'll be seeing them a lot more in the rest of this talk. So the first part in that case, bilingualism and cognition, and especially the intricate interplay between individual factors. So a lot of you will be familiar with the work that shows that certain lifetime experiences can attenuate age-related diseases or age-related symptoms, including things like dementia, and bilingualism is one of them. And I will tell you a little bit more about that. But before I do that, I would like to share some numbers with you. And this is probably the most depressing part of today's talk, and from here on, it will only get better. But these numbers are not always so good to hear about, maybe. This is census data information, essentially. This is taken from Dutch census data, but it's very similar in terms of a picture across the Western world. So this is projections by 2040, some years down the road. There'll be many more older people to start with. So the demographic is changing. But that itself is not a problem, right? The fact that there are more older people. But the fact is, of course, that not all of them are aging as healthily. So by 2014, the projection is that there'll be 96% more dementia cases to the current situation. And what is also true is that related to that, there's more dementia-related deaths. So a huge increase if you look at the numbers. And purely looking at the Dutch context, and the same is true elsewhere, dementia-related deaths are projected to take over from cardiovascular diseases as the primary cause of death in 2040. So that's quite substantial. And what is sometimes forgotten with the focus on neurodegenerate diseases is that loneliness, quality of life, all of these kinds of factors are also impacted with more older people. So there's quite a large projected number of extra people who express a feeling of loneliness, not feeling at ease, a diminished quality of life. So I think against the backdrop of all of this, it becomes even more important to talk about what kind of lifetime experiences can help to achieve more healthy years. And just to show you also how dementia and loneliness can be related, there's 2 slides I would like to go into. The first has to do with memory problems, mild cognitive impairment, because this is something that many people experience after a certain age. So whereas at a certain stage, you can see that in the diagram as well, it's typically subjective cognitive decline. After, it can also transfer, let's say, to more mild cognitive impairment. And mild cognitive impairment is typically seen as a fluid or transitional stage between normal aging and dementia. It's not irreversible, Sometimes it can just be a period in your life where there's a lot going on and you start showing symptoms that are close to mild cognitive impairment, but it can also be a precursor of dementia. It's a very heterogeneous disorder, actually, so it's hard to explain in a lot of detail, but what it comes down to is that there's impairments in one or more cognitive domains, but at the same time, daily activities are not impacted. So people can still go about their daily lives. It's also associated with mood problems. So the two often go hand in hand. As with memory complaints, there's also often mood complaints that people talk about. And just to show you that link even more closely, this next slide also shows more depressive feelings or feelings of loneliness, sometimes even as severe that you could classify it as late life depression. And mood problems are actually really prevalent, very, very prevalent in old age. So about 14% of people in community dwelling areas report this, but in care homes, it's even up to 40 to 50% sometimes of people reporting mood disorders. It's also true that, and you can see that in the kind of flow chart on the right, sometimes this is a direct consequence of mild cognitive impairment, sometimes it leads to mild cognitive impairment, and sometimes there's normal cognition. But what you often see is that people who suffer from late life depression, they also score relatively low on cognitive tests. And they continue to do that. So even once their mood problems have been tackled and addressed, they continue to show relatively poor performance on cognitive tests. They also show an increased chance of developing Alzheimer's disease. But the good news, and we'll come back to that in the third part of the presentation, is that cognitive training does seem to work. So it does seem to have an effect. So as I said, this is not the most cheerful part of the presentation, but I think it's important to realize and how to place this work. Because right now there's no agent, no pharmacological agent, no medication, no medicine to attenuate or slow down the mild cognitive impairment. There's not such a thing. There's no medicine. But we do know that there are certain life experiences that can lead to cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve then being that in the face of brain pathology, some individuals are not affected by that as much compared to others, seemingly. So some people have built up cognitive reserve. And there's a whole bunch of factors that have been associated with cognitive reserve. And these are just a couple of them. So playing a musical instrument, for instance, being physically active, but also seemingly quite simple activities like engaging in meaningful discussions and interactions can actually lead to cognitive reserve. These are all things that you can do something, you have some sort of control over. It's important to realize, I think as well, that there are some factors that are associated with cognitive reserve that just are the way they are, right? So education, social economical status, even personality traits, so whether you're outgoing or not. And I think it's a lot to go into all of those, but I did include a reference that shows more of how cognitive reserve can be built up and what kind of life experience or life experiences can lead up to it. And at this stage, I think it's important to point out one particular lifetime experience and one that I think we all share in terms of interests, and that's bilingualism or multilingualism. So lifelong bilingualism has been shown to be a protective effect or to be a protective factor against the onset of some age-related diseases or symptoms, including dementia symptoms. And this is quite robust work, different parts of the world that have shown this. But at the same time, there's more and more realization and more awarenesses to this as well, is that this is, of course, not just lifelong bilingualism, but lifelong individual bilingualism. There's no two bilinguals that are the same in terms of how old they were when they first learned the languages, to what extent they now actually still use them, their switching behavior between languages possibly as well. So it's a very dynamic continuum. That's a very important word to use as well, right? So it's not an either or. You can't put people in a monolingual group or a bilingual group, but this is a continuum going on. And there's, of course, a whole bunch of references that I could use there. I included two that we use quite a lot in our lab, but these are just some references to show you more about that. And of course, if there's one life stage where there could be even more individual variable experiences, it's in older adulthood. you've lived longer, essentially. So you've been able to gather many more life experiences. And what has been hard anyway is how to disentangle life experiences such as musical training, actively engaging in stimulating discussions, or things like being physically active, from bilingualism effects on the other hand. And this is even harder to do in older adulthood, where all of these things are just accumulated. So disentangling the role of life experiences from bilingual life experiences is a difficult thing to do. And what has sometimes been done, or what has been attempted, is to look at larger cohort studies. So larger groups of a couple of hundred, sometimes even a couple of thousand people, and see how these different kinds of variables relate or modulate aging and healthy aging. So here's an example of some of those. So on the left, you see some recent references that go into individual bilingual contexts in more detail. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but the fact that, what I already said, right? The fact that you have these different kinds of contexts for bilinguals. So essentially that social linguistic narratives become even more important. They start to influence psycholinguistic outcomes or studies as well. And this is something that I cannot stress often enough, because I think this is a hugely important turn that our field is taking. And at the same time, that also means that we might want to take that one step further. At the moment, most psycholinguistic studies still use the term bilingualism instead of multilingualism, and also taken to comprise multilingual perspectives as well, but they are essentially different types of multilingual experiences. So I would be very much in favor of distinguishing between bilingualism, multilingualism as well. But looking more into the cohort, and I'll be happy to discuss this later on with you during the discussion period. But returning to the cohort studies, there have been two contexts specifically that I would like to share with you, both in a European kind of setting, one our setting, the Dutch setting, and one the Swiss. So the first is a cohort study that one of our PhD candidates, and she finished in 2019, she defended, Anna Pot, did, and the paper came out in 2018 in Brain Sciences. And what we tried to do in a large number, about 493 people, we wanted to see under which circumstances these people would show an advantage now in their third age, right? So now they were all over the age of 65. So under what kind of circumstances would they show some kind of cognitive superior performance, specifically on a test that we used, which was the flanker test. And many of you may be familiar with that. And if not, ask me about this later on, but it's typically a cognitive flexibility inhibition task. And we found that only those who used their languages, really continued to use their languages, but in different domains, showed an effect. And specifically, if in the social domain you used one language and outside of that domain used another, so outside of the home, that's when you started seeing effects. These people performed better compared to those people who didn't have that the dual languages going on. So this is very much in line with the adaptive control hypothesis. But what we also found, and this initially surprised us a little bit, is that it's not so much that this factor of multilingualism and language use and bilingual experience by itself did something, but only when it was looked at in conjunction with another variable, namely openness to new experiences, which is more a personality trait. So we did a partial least squares analysis, and initially multilingualism didn't show up as a predictor, but it did in conjunction with these other experiences. And that just goes to show that these factors are so intricately related. So we looked into the literature and we found specifically a Swiss cohort study, and this was not a language related study, not a bilingualism related study, but looking into cognitive performance in older adulthood and how different kinds of factors played into that. Language wasn't part of it, but the interesting thing that really came across from those studies and that fed into our results as well is that it was specifically openness to new experiences that apparently was a predictor of how well people would do in cognitive tasks at an older adult stage. And we found that that was very interesting because it's the same thing that we found. And in this study, they explained it by means of, well, maybe it's an indirect effect, saying if you're open to new experiences, you might have larger social networks, seek out interactions as well, right? So those are interesting, they all come into play. And indeed, in a follow-up study, 2018, a few years down the road, they said, well, cognition was influenced by social capital, and I love that word, accumulated over the lifespan. But essentially what it comes down to is meaningful social interactions and also your social network, essentially. So these are our larger cohort studies that really show how all of these factors come into play, but that it seems to be personality traits partly as well, openness to new experiences that interconnect with bilingualism. So I think that to that extent, this is what I would like to share in terms of how these different factors interrelate and how they interconnect. But of course, all of this, what I've presented so far, had to do with people who were already bilingual. So people who either from birth or from a young age onwards, or even later in life, but they continue to use their languages typically when they were tested, which was in older adulthood. So of course, that begs the question, what if people are functionally monolingual, so people who don't have that advantage, people who don't, when they're about 65, they don't have that multilingual experience to bring into them that could add up to cognitive reserve. So what if they don't have that? Can we still teach them a new language at an older adult age, so post the age of 65? And can you then find effects that are similar to the effects that you find for people who have that advantage of being lifelong bilinguals? And that's where third age language learning comes into play. And this has been a relatively new area of investigation. And I saw that some people are here who've done a lot of work on that. Simone Fenger, for instance. So I'll be sharing some of that work later on as well. But in a way, before research looked into this, this was already quite a thing, right? There's quite a lot of courses, University of the Third Age, all of these kinds of courses for seniors, and language courses are traditionally quite popular as courses to take. Even, and this I thought was interesting as well, even in contexts where the language that you learn is not actually, you cannot use it. So for instance, learning English in Japan is interesting, but at the same time, you probably won't be able to use it unless you, of course, travel, which is not an option in the current day and age, but maybe it will be, hopefully, again soon. So this is some of that we're going into it. So there's not a lot of studies yet. It's still very much emerging, but it's an interesting field still, late life language learning. And there's on the right-hand side, you can find a couple of reviews and reviewed papers that also look into a synthesis of work that's already been done, and also point out the kind of future directions that the field could be going into. But for now, what I would like to point out is just to show you what kinds of tendencies have been found in the studies that we do have these days. So one of them is that there's lasting improvements in attention. So attention increases when people sign up for language courses and in older adulthood, and that apparently sticks, right? So that's a lasting improvement in attention. It does have to be said, though, in that 2016 Buck et al. Paper, that they had to continue to use and learn the language for those lasting effects to actually show up. But it's important to point out, there was also some evidence for improved global cognitive functioning, specifically in MCI patients. And this is interesting against a backdrop of the slide that I presented earlier on. And also the fact that there were increased feelings of well-being, people felt more confident, and they also had an increased sense of autonomy. So more the social affective variables increased as well as a function in the course of these language courses or interventions. But having said that, at the same time, there's not so much research that integrates these. So interestingly, language learning is typically seen as a tool. And it's also, by the way, how we do it partly, right? So we view this as a way to achieve something else. So to achieve cognitive flexibility and in older adulthood, to increase well-being in older adults as well. But it's also interesting, of course, to look at language improvements, because that might very well be a reason why older adults sign up for language courses in the first place. So ideally, there's going to be more research that integrates all of these different domains. So linguistic or language outcomes, cognitive effects, and also social or socio-affective variables to emerge from late life language interventions. And just to show you how variable the work that's been done is so far, I've prepared the following slide for you. So this is going into the review study that Anna Pot and Joanna Porkert did and came out about 1.5 years ago. So this was up until that point in time. So there were 8 studies done at that point. There's more now. And Simone can tell you more about that as well, because there's some studies from her lab that emerged. We've been doing some studies since then. But right back in those days, so 2018, it really varied from only 9 people to 160. And the mean age was on the lower side of the third age, so roughly between 68 to 70 years of age, which is also interesting. And we recently had a talk with a person who in charge of the courses for the University of the Third Age in Groningen. And she said this is drastically changed over the years. So whereas before we only had people taking our courses who were roughly around this age, and now we have people who've been taking our courses for over 30 years, so who are essentially now 90, or so the older participants could have been the parents generation-wise of the younger people taking their University of the Third Age courses. So I think that in itself, that development is quite interesting. And just goes to show, right, that people do get older these days and want some sort of meaningful pastime experience. In terms of language constellation, this is one of our, and we'll come back to that later on as well, but for us, it was one of the hardest choices to make. If you want to learn a new, or if you want to teach a new language to older adult, what language do you pick? And a lot of the studies so far have looked at L2 English. Some of them also minority languages, so either Basque in Spain, or looked at, for instance, Gaelic in a Scottish context. So minority languages that were not the first or mother tongues of the people who were taking part, and even Latin, ancient language. And I think all of that is very interesting. We had to think about this as well. And the general tendency going into this is the more demanding it is, maybe the better the effects to ensue from this would be. On the other hand, motivation also plays a huge part. And this is something that we've noticed as well in our studies. People do have a clear idea themselves of which languages they want to tackle. The teaching methods is also something that I want to very briefly say something about now, and I will come back to that later on. Most of the studies so far have been like a classical classroom kind of setup, normal materials that you would use for any kind of language learning intervention, with the one exception, of course, that these are not your average learners, right? These are older adults. And there are no materials or lesson plans or studies that have been done specifically looking at older adults. So we don't know what their language learning needs would be and what kinds of materials would work for them. Sometimes I came across a Polish book, which was specifically to learn English for older adults in Poland. The only thing that was different was that it was a larger font, and that was it, right? So nothing else. So I think this will come back to that later on. But there are differences, obviously. Some studies that we've looked at really had more like interactions between native speakers. A lot of them used blended learning design. So part of it was face-to-face interactions, and then technology-based computer-assisted language learning as well. And it was really very different from just 1 week of a very intense course to 8 months with various intensities. But interestingly, and I said this before, there were not that many studies that have actually looked at language measures, so pre-post test in terms of language measures. The ones that did had a more of a closed gap kind of procedure, so a C-test or grammaticality judgment task, but not typically something to actually assess oral proficiency or communicative intent or content. There were, out of the 8 studies, 3 studies that actually looked at socio-affective measures, motivation, well-being effects, quality of life, loneliness measures. And we've seen some examples of that in terms of outcome. And the cognitive tasks, I mean, this is the one thing that interests most people. I mean, can you, in a way, once cognitive decline has started to set in, maybe MCI, or maybe things like mood disorders, can you counter that? So can you either prevent people from slipping into dementia, or can you maybe make the progress go less fast. But the hard thing is, in that sense, is that there is no overlap between cognitive tests. So there's a lot of cognitive tests that people have used, from general cognitive states to switching, working memory, spatial intelligence, inhibition, concentration, but none of them are similar. And that makes the comparison across studies very difficult to do at the moment. So that also brings me to the largest chunk. There we go. And that will be our own ongoing work. So what kind of studies are we doing within the BALAB, the Bilingualism and Aging Lab, that looks into some of this? So that's what I would like to share with you next. And the first thing that we try to do, there's a lot of merit, we feel, in case-based studies to start with. So just to trying to see if what works for individuals, having more focused group discussions maybe. But at the same time, there's, in larger cohort studies, you can look at different variables, see how they interact. So we've teamed up with Lifelines, and for a project that we call Bilingual Lifelines. It's more like an epidemiological study that looks into how bilingual language experiences and multilingual language experiences, how they relate to other kinds of healthy aging factors. So Lifelines is a cohort study in the north of the Netherlands that is actually initiated by our university medical center. So it's very much working together with medical protocols as well. And they looked at grandparents, parents, and children. So 3 generations. They followed them for 30 years. And every 5 years, bio data is being collected, but every year and a half, they send out questionnaires, they do cognitive testing. So they have a lot of information, essentially. And they also have the opportunity to use the infrastructure to have add-on studies. So to send out additional questionnaires, something of the sort. So that's what we did. We send out questionnaires specifically in the older adult age range. So that's about 12,500 people over the age of 65. And this is only the north of the Netherlands, I should say that. So it's a population-based study. 10% of the northern Netherlandic population takes part in this. And the north of the Netherlands, for those who may not be, and many of you may not be, and why would you, right, be familiar with the Dutch context? But the north of the Netherlands is surprisingly multilingual. So there's, of course, the province of Friesland, Frisia, which is bilingual, right? There's the Frisian and Dutch, both being national languages, but there's also a lot of dialect speakers in the northern region. So people who speak Lower Saxon, a variety of them, and people with a minority language background. So there's quite a lot of multilingual language use and variation within the north. So we send out essentially language experience questionnaires, very brief, about 10 questions. It has to do with the fact that it's quite a costly endeavor to add on to a study within Lifelines, but quite a questionnaire that not only tapped into, or specifically did not tap into, things like how many languages do you speak, but specifically questions like, do you regularly switch between them? What is your attitude towards your own multilingualism? Which languages do you speak? Right, so all of these more experience-based factors. Of course, also standard things like how many and how old were you when you acquired them, but still. And then we also added a music questionnaire, so musical experience, and I'll come back to that later on to say exactly why we did that. But within that, there's now 3 separate projects within the Bilingual Lifelines project that look into different parts of it. So what we do is we have those language questionnaires and music questionnaires, and we connect that with all of the information that's already in the Lifelines database, cognitive information, health information as well. And when we send out this questionnaire, about 6,000 people responded and filled it out. So we have a nice number of people that looked into it. So to start with, Saskia Nijmeijer, on the very left, our PhD candidate, is looking into the general question whether mental health in elderly is related to language or to music experience, or indeed both. And one of the reasons, like an interconnection between the two. because there are people who are multilingual and experienced musicians, or they've have experience with musical instruments throughout their lives. And one of the reasons why we did that is to disentangle, or to look at the connection between these two lifetime experiences that are so often coined as being important to add to cognitive reserve. Then Jelle Brouwer, right there in the middle, right, looks at more the interplay between bilingualism factors and bilingual experiences, and more of this you can call it social capital, the way that has been termed in previous years, but looking at social networks, quality of life in older adulthood as well, because there are questions within the Lifelines database that go into this. And this is interesting because intuitively you can think of that you might have larger social networks if you are more multilingual, right? That you speak one language with a certain cohort of people and another language with another. But this would be providing evidence for that. And then the final part, which is Floor van den Berg's part within Lifelines, is what is the connection between the prevalence of neurological diseases, and that includes Alzheimer's, but also Parkinson's, MS as well, and bilingualism. And unfortunately, Lifelines doesn't have information about onset of these diseases, so we can use that information, just prevalence. But this is still ongoing. So I would love to present actual data, but we don't have that yet. So maybe around this time next year, let's hope, or we can actually meet up in the fall, then we'll be able to present some of this work. But it's to show you the kind of work that we do. So this is the epidemiological part of it. What we also do, obviously, is more the empirical side. So we look at how language learning interventions, different types of them, can be an innovative, healthy aging tool. So again, coming back to that question, if you don't really have the experience of being a lifelong bilingual, can you still come close to some of these effects? So roughly, you can say we have three research questions that govern the work that we do within that. So the first is, does learning a language after the age of 65 induce certain unique effects on cognition, as opposed to maybe other kinds of skills, other kinds of interventions? So we have different kinds of other conditions, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. But also, and this is again coming back to something that we've talked about before, but what are the language learning needs of older adults in the first place? So this is moving away, I suppose, from more the neurocognitive side of things and more to applied linguistics. There's lots of information, lots of studies on what the best and effective teaching methods would be, but they're geared towards secondary school students or tertiary, university education, different kinds of settings, adult settings even, but not older adults. So what would be the specific language learning needs of older adults and their preferences as well? And the third, to what extent can the language learning be beneficial cognitively for healthy seniors? Of course, that's a group that we look at, but also those on a continuum of mood and memory problems. So seniors with MCI as well, late life depression. So we look at all of these questions, both in healthy seniors, but also in preclinical and clinical populations. And for that, we also work together with the University Medical Hospital. So all of these studies are slightly different, but they have an underlying methods that are very similar to all of them. So I would like to talk you through the study design and then individual studies and show you the results as well if we have them, and tell you about the ongoing work if that's the case. So we always do a pre-screening to start with. And these are all people between the age of 65 to 85 years old. So that's the age range that we're looking for to be able to include them in our work. And these are all functionally monolingual in Dutch. And I know that the Netherlands does not have the best track record when it comes to monolingualism, and we're not. But at the same time, there are quite a few older adults still who really in their daily lives only use Dutch and can understand some English, but are really, really at a low proficiency level, very basic level. But even that, functionally monolingual in Dutch, they should use Dutch 80% of the time in their daily lives. And they can have basic English or music skills. Music, because one of our other conditions is a music condition. and we use a randomized controlled trial to divide them into different categories. So we want to know already at the pre-screening level that they have a basic English and music skills, but are not musicians or I don't know, translators or interpreters or anything of the sort. Those people that at the pre-screening showed that they could be included, then enter into a pre-test that we divide over 2 sessions because it's quite lengthy, because they fill out quite a few questionnaires. And this has to do with language background, obviously, but also things like quality of life, depressive thoughts, overall physical fitness, right? So there's quite a few things that we go into, and also neuropsychological tests. Too many to go into, but if you want to know a little bit more about the kinds of tests that we use, feel free to ask during the question period. One of the tasks that we use across the different studies that we've got going on is a color shape switching task, which is working quite well actually for us and discriminates really nicely between individuals. The next phase is the intervention itself, lasts for 3 months, and we have, of course, a language learning condition, but we also have different kinds of intervention. One of them is a music intervention, but there's a few more, and I will go into more detail in a little while. But what we do is that we randomly assign participants, included participants, to one of the conditions. And this is really done to reduce bias. Many come to us and have a clear preference as to what they would like to learn, so in which group they would like to be placed, and then we have to tell them it's random. It's a randomized controlled trial. It's also true, by the way, that the people who do the pre-test and the post-test are blind as to the condition, and that's important to realize as well. So this is really very much borrowing from the medical sciences. And then after 3 months of whatever intervention they've been given, we do a post-test, essentially the same as a pre-test, to look into either improvements, people deteriorating over time, maybe being kept constant as well. And then 6 months after the entire thing, so 6 months after the intervention, we do a follow-up, a retention test, to see if any kinds of effects are longer lasting or whether they stop after not being involved in either a language course or a different kind of intervention. So that's the setup roughly. So I would like to just take the time to go through the different specific projects with you. One of the first ones is by Saskia Nijmeijer, that you see on the right-hand side there, a FlexLang project, which is a behavioral project, and before COVID set in, also EEG and FNIRS. And today is actually not only King's Day, but it's also a good day for Saskia, because her new paper just came out today in Frontiers of Aging Neuroscience. So I added the identification number for you there. So this is actually the paper that came out as the protocol paper on the basis of that study. What Saskia did is she looked at people with subjective memory complaints, so subjective cognitive problems, and they were randomly placed in either a language learning condition, which was essentially an English course, communicative based, looking into speaking and listening skills. There was also the music training where people were placed and learned how to play the guitar, and a final group of creative workshops. So I should say that both the language learning and the music training, they were groups that met every 2 weeks, face-to-face initially. In later months that had to be moved to an online meeting, but there were classes, small group classes. And the rest of the time they spent about 45 minutes each day looking into or practicing their language skills or music skills. So this was like a blended learning setup. The other group, so the creative workshop group, they just met every 2 weeks. So this was like a social passive control, you can say, condition. So they met face-to-face in these creative workshops and arts and crafts, but they weren't asked to do anything other than that. So, so far, and this has really been challenging because we now have this set of data. Part of it's been collected in a certain manner with actual EEG data, FNIRS data. The rest is only behavioral. Some was actually online, and some of it was done in person. So we have to combine and look into analysis to look into that. And this is very, very tentative. But what we see so far, and the last groups have just finished their post-test, so are now being analyzed as well. But what we see so far is over the course of 3 months, the creative people, the creative workshop elderly slowly started to deteriorate when it came to the cognitive skills. And this is a normal process, right? 3 months can be quite a lengthy time. So it's not a surprise in that sense that you score a little bit worse on a cognitive test compared to earlier on. We didn't see that so much for the language or the music training. There was no, this is also important, there was no difference so far in the language learning versus musical training, but they didn't deteriorate, they didn't improve either, but there was maintenance of cognitive skills. And I think that's also an important finding to share with you. So moving on from Saskia's project, more to applied linguistics, because Saskia is very much an interdisciplinary project that is supervised both by the medical faculty and by the arts faculty, so by us. And we move on to Merel van der Ploeg's project, Vitaal. And if you know Dutch, taal means language. So it's a bit of a nice acronym. Also behavioral study, but also including EEG and FNIRS when it was still allowed, and now only behavioral. I can refer you to a research note that came out last year about this project in the Dutch Journal of Applied Linguistics. And this is very much asking the question, what do older adults need? So of course you can do language interventions and compare it to other types of interventions, but at the same time, if the language intervention doesn't really target the language needs of older adults, then that itself might be missing its target. So that's what, essentially, this is what Mara's question is all about. So she had 2 groups, language learning groups, English as well, so teaching both of them English, but one learning in an implicit way and the other one more in an explicit way. So for those of you who are familiar with this dichotomy almost in applied linguistics, it makes perfect sense. But just to explain a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, in implicit learning, there's a lot of emphasis on input, on authentic language input as well. Not a lot on communication, interaction, not a lot of attention for actual grammar rules, for instance. That's different for explicit language learning, which is very much about learning grammar rules, word lists as well. So she compared both groups. Is in the process of comparing both groups. But in the meantime, another important part of her study is also looking into language needs. So setting up a survey questionnaire based on what older adults need, what their preferences will be, and that I can already share with you. So what we found, first of all, and what Mara found specifically, is that the communicative competence seemed to be one of the main aims that older adults who signed up for a language course said is this is what I wanted to get out of it for travel needs, but also, and this is again coming back to what we said earlier on, for personal fulfillment. I take a language course because I want to, not because I need it, but because I want to learn a new language. I think that's something that I always wanted to do, so I'll do that. So I think that was one of the nice things to come out of this. But also that they had very specific requirements or ideas about what would be the ideal setup of a language class for them, saying, well, small groups would be beneficial for us, blended learning designs where it's part of, is it technology based, part of it is classes, and just being in control of our own learning process. So what we found especially is that these older adults, they've had a lifelong experience of learning and knowing what works for them. So they had quite clear ideas of what would work and what would not work. That also meant that the people that we randomly put into the explicit condition didn't always like to be put in the explicit condition, but it's we try to explain, you know, this is we're putting you into different kinds of groups. And very interesting that all of them said, well, you're never too old to learn a new language. And the fact that we have all this world knowledge may actually help in acquiring a language. You can use that to the benefit. And then as a final thing, and I'll round off so we can actually get to discussions as well. Another ongoing project is Jelle Brouwer's project and Floor van den Berg's project. This is actually a VIDI project that was just introduced at the very beginning. It's a behavioral project, also includes eye tracking, pupillometry data as well. Interestingly, this, in terms of setup, this looks a lot like Saskia Nijmeier's project, both in terms of language learning and a music training condition, with the one exception that instead of creative workshops, we now have lecture series. So essentially, these are colleagues of ours from different faculties at the University of Groningen who have a very low thresholdy accessible lecture, and it's followed by a number of discussion questions at the end. So these people get together every 2 weeks as well for all the groups, with the exception that the language learning and the music training group also do something themselves, 45 minutes a day. And the lecture series people just attend the lectures, and then the rest they don't have to do. So in this project, as opposed to Saskia, who looked at subjective memory complaints, here we also include medical or clinical and preclinical populations. So looking at the timeline of the final project, it's actually the healthy wave just started with healthy participants being included, but the preclinical waves are actually planned for August of this year up until January of next year, where we hope to include about 25 MCI patients and also 25 late life depression patients. And that is followed again by healthy waves 2 and 3 in the early spring of next year and following that. So that would be the gist of it. So that's trying to show you how bilingualism and cognition are intricately related, and that could even be harder to disentangle in the older adult lifespan. But at the same time, that there are these studies that can, in a way, go towards some of that disentangling, mainly by introducing a bilingual experience at an older adult life stage to people who are not already multilingual. And I've also hoped to show you some of the work that we're doing and have been doing within our lab, within the Bilingualism and Aging Lab in Groningen. So the final thing that I would like to do is just to show you a couple of add-on studies to the larger projects that have been going on, just to show you the future directions where we'd like to take this as well, apart from the work that's going on and that it's continued to be finalized. Is we have projects looking into, for instance, resting state EEG as predictors of language learning success in older adults, but also really we very much like to elaborate on the third age language learning needs with focus group interviews, with classroom study designs where we actually try to develop lesson materials as well, and in different settings. So we have, for instance, one of our PhD students has a Polish background, is looking into the difference between the Netherlands versus Poland, where the linguistic landscape is vastly different. So that is something that we hope to do. And that also means that I would like to leave you with all of these credits, of course, to our fantastic PhD students, but also to our funder, MVO, the Dutch scientific organization, for funding the research that we're about to do.